We're going to look at 10 of the cheapest places in the United States, 10 of the cheapest states to move into the country. Hey everybody, Chad Cruiser here with Health and Homestead. Number 10 is not actually the 10th cheapest. I threw it in there because it's hard to find cheap land in the far western states. You can find some relatively cheap land still up in areas in the state of Washington. Up in Washington, if you're up in some of the northeast or north central, very rural areas, you can still find some land that's pretty cheap. It's a beautiful area. I mean, the most beautiful areas of the country are out in the West. In my opinion, I've spent time out there, lived out in Oregon, spent time in places, looked at land in Washington, Idaho, gorgeous areas, but they've really gone up in price, but there's still some relatively cheaper land in northern Washington state. So that is an option. You have the beautiful area of Republic. You got obviously Spokane, you got the city up there in the northeast, but there's really just some incredible land out in those parts. Not as cheap as it used to be. Really nothing in the States are as cheap as they used to be, especially since times have gotten pretty crazy. But we'll call that number 10. That is the state of Washington. Number 9 is actually one of the top 10, and that is the state of Wyoming. The state of Wyoming is one of the top 10 cheapest states to live in, and there's a reason why certain states are cheap, and actually most of the cheaper states have one thing in common, and that's that people don't make as much money there. Now that's not always true. It could actually be that they do make as much, but there's just not as many jobs, and that's the case with Wyoming. There probably are some really good jobs in the petroleum industry and the oil industry, but when it comes to finding a job, there's just not as many jobs because there's just not as many people. There's hardly anybody in the state. Wyoming is a beautiful state with mountains and ravines that still feels like the Wild West. You have Yellowstone National Park. There's plenty of land, wide open spaces, and if you've ever been there, it really truly is big sky country. They call it that, and when you're there, you just notice it. It really is big sky country, and I've never been anywhere in my life that I've seen the stars so well as in the state of Wyoming. There are some negatives, like we already said. Finding a job might be difficult. Now, if you're someone who can work from home, that may not be a problem for you. But the more rural that a community is, the harder it is to find a job. That's obvious. And so, but another thing is that one of the legalities of the state is Wyoming deems that the water that you have on your property is property of the state of Wyoming, whereas, just next door in South Dakota, they deem that the water on someone's property is owned by the individual on the property. And so these are kind of things that probably won't be a problem, but if they ever wanted them to be, they probably could make it a problem for you. So legalities are always something to think about in different states, but let's move on to number 8. Number 8 is the great state of Georgia. Georgia is actually specifically the 9th cheapest state to live in. Atlanta really grew up after the Olympics in 1996. It just kind of really just started to explode after that time. It has some of the craziest road system in America. I mean, so many lanes, it's incredible, but there's still plenty of rural land to find in the state of Georgia, all around areas that are outside of any of the major cities. But you go up into the northeast, you get toward the Appalachian Mountains, and that's just a gorgeous area there. Georgia ranks 27th in the nation in violent crime, so they're really kind of middle of the road when it comes to being a dangerous state. And one of the things about living there is if you ever need anything, if you ever need to go to the big city to get something, obviously you got Atlanta you can go into. They're going to have all the supplies that you need. They also have a great airport, so if you're someone who needs to be close enough to an airport, that's an option. You can be just far enough out that you can come in and do whatever you got to do. Number 7 is the beautiful state of Michigan. Michigan is a state that is surrounded by water. There's more waterfront in Michigan than in Florida. And you don't think about it, but when you got the Upper Peninsula, you got the Lower Peninsula, you got the Great Lakes surrounding it. And so there's a lot of lakes and water everywhere you go. So no matter where you are in Michigan, you're not far from a lake, either a big lake or the inland lakes. And so there's a lot of cheaper lakefront property in Michigan. You also have a lot of farmland throughout the state of Michigan. Well, this is kind of a negative. It's one of the, I think it's like in the top 11 most expensive states for taxes, which is kind of surprising. I'm not exactly sure why that is. anywhere above like the top half of Michigan is most all of it is pretty rural. There's little towns here and there like Traverse City and so forth, Big Rapids and whatnot, but most of it is just rural land. I mean, you can go right outside of any of those towns and it's pretty seriously rural. If you go up to the UP up here, it's even more rural. It's ridiculously rural. You go up there and you can find land sometimes for as cheap as like $1,000 an acre. You probably can't buy 1 acre for $1,000, but there are times where you get enough land, it's $1,000 an acre. Now, the thing about it is there's a lot of snow. I mean, a lot of snow in the winter. And if you go way up in the northwest to the city of Houghton, they get an average of nearly 17 feet of snow every single year. So it's a serious place. If you're really hardy, you can handle the cold weather, you don't mind that can be totally fine. Also, gardening's a bit more difficult. A greenhouse would really be helpful up there. Even a heated greenhouse would be even better. And so these are things to consider, but it's super cheap land up there. It's not hard to find rural property in Michigan or in the UP. Number 6 is a state that people are coming from all around to right now, and that's the state of Tennessee. Tennessee is gorgeous. You have hills kind of throughout much of the state. You have the mountains on the eastern side of the state. The Appalachian mountain range kind of goes up the whole eastern portion of the state. Beautiful land there. Prices have gone up, and often in the mountain regions, they're beautiful places to be. There's a lot of springs and rivers and creeks and those kind of things, but it's more expensive to get those properties, and often those properties also don't have a lot of nice land or they don't have land that lays all that well, and as a result of it, it can be hard to do things like gardening or agriculture. But if you can find a spot up in those regions, it can be just fantastic. But a lot of the rest of the state does have land that lays really well, so you can grow your own food and those kind of things. And it's also considered to be one of the freest states, and that's why people are coming from as far as California, trying to go to a place that, number one, is cheaper, but because so many people are going there right now, the prices have gone up. But it's a beautiful state, has low regulations compared to most states, and so you can find property with basically no restrictions in some areas. You got to make sure, you got to look into that. If you're actually purchasing a property, you got to make sure that property is, if that's what you're looking for anyway. But Tennessee is a great option. Number 5 is New Mexico. New Mexico is a jewel of a state. You have mountains kind of all over the place. Mountains and deserts are the common things you find in New Mexico. But up in the mountains, you can find some beautiful areas in the high desert regions that actually, they even have areas that are treed. So you might have the beautiful ponderosa pine up there, and just gorgeous, glorious areas. One of the negatives, though, being the fact that it's a desert. Obviously, you can have a lack of water, so water is something you need to think about if you're going to move to a place like Arizona or New Mexico. But right along with that, when you're up in those mountains, when the air is really dry, it doesn't hold heat very well at night. Well, that's great for sleeping. It makes for wonderful sleeping in New Mexico because it can cool down at night, even in the summer in those regions. The trouble is, it can sometimes, if you're high enough up, it can cool down so much that you might have frost even in the summer sometimes up in the mountain region. So you got to watch out for that. If you're not growing food, it doesn't really matter, but if you're looking to sustain your family with a garden or agriculture, that is something to consider. And, well, you have to either have a greenhouse or just be growing really cold hardy foods like the brassicas and so forth. But New Mexico is a jewel. One of the downsides is that it's the second most dangerous state in the United States. So that's something to consider. But when you get further out into the countryside, typically it's safer out there anyway. But New Mexico is glorious. I've lived there in the past. I love the state of New Mexico. It's beautiful. Now, Missouri takes the 4th spot at one of the cheapest areas to move into the country if you want to do country living. Missouri has a lot of beauty. So you do have the Ozark region, and these kind of areas are very, very inexpensive compared to much of the rest of the country. You can also find land that has very little to no restrictions. And so this might be a place you'd have to look into it specifically for where you're buying land. But some people are interested in the tiny house movement, if that's something you're into, because most places in the United States, it's illegal to have a tiny house. There's restrictions on how small you can build. And so a place like Missouri might be a place that you can do that. You can find plenty of farmland in the state of Missouri, but you can also find the Ozark type regions where you have hills, or they call them mountains, but they're not quite as big as what we would normally think of as mountains, but still really beautiful regions there. And Another great thing about it is food costs are going to be significantly lower than most of the country, and property tax is lower than most of the country also. So all around, this kind of a state could be a great place to move if these are the things that you're looking for. And by the way, Missouri has the lowest real estate prices in the nation. So you really can't beat Missouri when it comes to cheap. That's what you're going to find there. Now, number 3 on our list is going to be the state of Oklahoma. You got Oklahoma City, but you also have tons of rural land. And being that this is the 3rd cheapest state to live in, this is just another state to consider. Number 2 on our list of cheapest states to live in is the state of Arkansas. Arkansas is a state that if somebody hasn't been to, they don't know about all the beauty that is in the state of Arkansas. You have the Ozarks, which are just a gem. They're also a region of very independent-minded people. So if you move into that area, that's the mindset of the people there, and that's obviously what people are often looking for in the country, is independent people, or just simply being an independent person, and you'll find plenty of that there. And it's cheap, at least in comparison with most of the rest of the country, and so that's a real region to look into. They don't always have the best soil for growing, but you might happen to find a property or a farmstead or something like this where that is an option. But that's something to look into because it could be very, very rocky soil. So check into that if you're looking in the state of Arkansas. It's a really nice place. Now, before we find the number 1 cheapest state to live in, by the way, if you like this video, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell notifications, hit the like button. But the number 1 cheapest state to live in is the state of Mississippi. You've noticed most of these states are down in the south. It's just cheaper down there. And speaking of Mississippi, one of the great things you have there is that you have much milder winters than the majority of the rest of the United States. So you have that going for you there. You also have quite a bit of rural land, and since it's cheaper than most areas, this can be an option to live in a cheap area that has pleasant winters and hot and muggy summers. So it all depends what you're looking for. I'm not saying these are the best places to live. I'm not saying at all. I don't think these overall are the best places. They are just some of the cheapest areas to live in the United States. Are there some other areas in the States that you found to be quite inexpensive? If you found them, let us know down in the comments. Share some thoughts down below. God bless and have a fantastic day.